everyone, this is update for November 24, 2024, day 1005 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up for all the dates since November 19, when there was a prior video. So I'm going to start with macro update, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this sort of military political situation, and then we're going to discuss a little bit situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. So I'm going to start with the UK, and there's a little bit of information that I thought is somewhat relevant because I don't want to repeat the same things as numbers don't really paint anything new trends, as things remain the same. I don't think it's sort of useful for viewers to repeat the same story, but who knows, if you guys think that this needs to be changed, let me know, and I will try to recommend to do that way. So a little bit about the UK. So as you can see, there are numbers for the manufacturing PMI, which, as you can see, is going down into negative territory, into contraction. And also, as you can see, service PMI is literally on the verge of contraction. So it went from 52 to 50. So for new viewers who forgot, 50 means anything above 50 is expansion. Anything below 50 is contraction. So and the lower it is, the worse the contraction is, and the higher above 50, the stronger the expansion is. So I think it's very intuitive metric that we can look. But as you can see, but then if you and the economy is really looked into one of their sort of many angles how to look at it. It's not the only one, but I would say is service plus manufacturing, and the combination of the two is give you good approximation of the economic situation. And if you add two together, this really implies that UK is going into recession. Why this is important is because this will also probably related to the let's say political upheaval in the UK. So a while ago I mentioned that when the Labour Party won election in the UK, they don't have any sort of solution to the problem, and sort of the problems will continue. And so, as you can see, this sort of we're back to the point where public is essentially fed up with the policies of the Labour Party. But the problem is the other side is so far it doesn't seem that they can propose any credible alternative that actually is a solution. And that's sort of the problem when you have two-party system where they both, it's kind of like oligopoly, right? And except it's political oligopoly, and it's never good. Like the worst is obviously monopoly, but oligopoly is just one notch, sort of a little bit better than monopoly, but it's still a bad situation, bad approach. And so, and in some ways, UK is kind of stuck between this sort of dysfunctional situation where both parties don't have a vision, don't have solution to the problem. So this really means that the situation is going to be from bad to worse until in the process of creative destruction, some solution will appear, obviously. The problem is to what extent that creative destruction is going to go. That's the only question in this case. Now let's move to Europe. And things in Europe pretty bleak, without any sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not surprise because the policies don't change. European leadership stays the course in terms of their economic policies, and specifically, as I mentioned many times, this war on conventional energy, which guarantees the same result, and the things will not change as long as this continues. But if we look very quickly, manufacturing is in decline, but it's been the story for sort of quite a while. But as you can see, even the entire EU right now firmly in a negative. That actually the only sort of, I wouldn't say there's anything positive, but there's a little bit bounce in Germany, where if you look at September, the number was completely horrific at 40. Now it's 43, but it's just generally, as a summary, things basically not going anywhere. Situation remains negative. The the other part that's actually, so this is not new story. I'd say I'm not sharing anything new here. It's all very clear. The part that is actually sort of developing an important and sort of new trend is the problem with the service part of the economy, because specifically France, as you can see, drop from 49 to 45 is a very significant number. And Germany turning into negative is again very significant number, and then the whole EU is sort of following these two countries because they really the driver of the European Union. So why this is important? Because before, while manufacturing was sort of getting destroyed, to extent politicians can kind of like pretend and extend, because they could still rely on service to carry employment. And the important part about the service is that that's probably bigger employer in the most developed world. And so now, as service turns negative, this really means that problem with employment will get much worse, with incomes gonna get much worse again, and that really leads to social unrest, political unrest, and political upheaval. And so in some ways, Europe is going to be facing the same problems as the UK is facing, because essentially there is no political party that's offering positive solution to the problem, and that I would say is the biggest problem in all of this situation, because all of these problems are solvable with the change in the attitudes and policies. But I think things in the coming months and quarters or whatever year are gonna get meaningfully worse in continental Europe, as we can see from these numbers. Now let's move to Japan. Japan also not doing terribly great. The same trend. I just want to have a quick update. So export is growing slowly, but the key point here is that trade balance is remaining negative, as you can see, and it's been negative for a while. So it goes back to what I was saying, is that Japanese economic model is broken, and where they essentially they export high value goods, and specifically that's why I'm showing here core machinery orders, and they are as you can see negative, even though this is not perfectly sort of coincides time wise, September versus October, but still gives general direction of where things are. So as you can see, the Japan is being essentially is becoming non-competitive and priced out of the global markets, and most likely by the likes of China, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, and even I would say Turkey. So, and that really means that why it's important, because Japan used to be significant provider of capital in the Western world, and so this situation is changing, and it appears is going to get only worse. And why it's important that Japan was a provider of capital is because it allowed um, global interest rates, or let's say interest rates in the Western world, to remain low, and specifically in the US, because what Japan would do in most cases, they would the way they do with this capital, they would go and buy US governmental debt, which obviously helps US to keep their interest rates low. Now, this important provider of capital to the US is essentially gone, or in the process of being gone. And that's why it's important, because then the interest rates in the US, they effectively drive significantly interest rates around the world. And now switching actually to the US and looking at the job market there, and the picture is essentially the same that I've been saying before, is that there's not really much of in terms of layoffs. As you can see, that non-seasonally or seasonally adjusted, these numbers are pretty low. I would say very low. And it's very interesting that both of them are actually the same. Sometimes that happens. But continuing jobless claims, so that's essentially a proxy for people who were already laid off, and how hard or difficult or easy for them to find new jobs. And as you can see, this number is pretty elevated, pretty high. That's again, this what I was saying, that once you lose job, it's very hard to find a new job. That's probably the best way to describe the situation in the US. But overall, US labor market is still there, and it's a major driver of the economy, and that's why the US Federal Reserve most likely will be will be focused on the labor market, because then it drives the entire financial system, because financial system needs spending from people who are, from a perspective of the financial system, are consumers. So they need consumer spending to maintain financial system, and so that's why labor market is critically important for Federal Reserve, which by its nature exists to protect financial system. So and because financial system has vested interest in maintaining labor market to extent possible, it doesn't mean that they can do magical things, but they will sort of resist natural moves in a labor market of adjustment for as much as they have power. But eventually they will get sort of overrun by sort of forces of nature, let's call it this way. And one of this force of nature is actually US governmental debt. So as of November 21, the number was about 36 trillion. So as you can see, the number is growing pretty fast. And obviously it's not sustainable. It's understood in US Central Bank or Federal Reserve also admitted that this number is not sustainable. So I would say everybody understands that this is non-sustainable path. And I think that's why you see politically in the US this Doge movement, or I won't call it movement, but this new ideas to change that situation. Whether they're going to be successful or not, it's still very unclear, because simply sort of trimming here or there a little bit, that's not a solution, because the problem is systemic. It's not about isolated cases, or because I've seen sort of this examples of like, okay, some governmental funding for things that are absolutely not necessity and extravagant, let's put this way. But that's not really the source of the problem. The biggest source, as I mentioned before, is really, I would say, U.S. healthcare system. That's where really unless there is a solution to U.S. healthcare system and more competitiveness, those are only two sort of sources that can unlock this solution to this problem. Everything else is basically, I would say, band-aids, even though they may look from a populist perspective as if there is some kind of solution in terms of like, getting rid of this waste in this government agency or that waste or whatever, but they really not solving the problem, and they really not moving the needle. So as I stated, it remains to be seen if there will be realistic solution to this problem. But as I mentioned before, no matter what, if there's no realistic solution, market will essentially force realistic solution. It's not gonna it's not happening in a month or two. It's probably like 2 years down the road. But that moment that's where the situation is moving. In some ways, I think there's intuition that things are going in that direction and something needs to be done. And the only question is, okay, do these people actually have right solution? That's a really biggest question. And this is just a prior numbers, just to give you sort of in terms of the jobless claims. So as you can see, prior period there was also low 200s, but continuing, as you can see, they consistently essentially increasing. Now let's a little bit switch closer to Ukraine. And actually, I want to discuss a little bit situation in Russian economy, which also could be on the verge of implosion for different reason. So, at high level, what's going on in Russian economy is that government essentially sucking up all of the resources for war effort. And at the same time, there is desire to sort of paint a picture of sort of happy life for average Russians, who is not disturbed by the war, not affected in any major way economically. So in some ways, Russian president is trying to insulate average Russian citizen from the war, from feeling sort of economic pain of the war. And I would say it's actually reminds very much what was going on in Germany during World War II up until last, let's say, couple years, where things were very clear you cannot insulate. And I think that's where Russia might be heading in that direction, that the Russian government has to sort of stop insulating because they simply run out of resources to continue insulating citizens. And that's where Russian government does not want to go to. And that might be the only sort of realistic reason why Russian government might be willing to have some negotiations about with Ukraine. And going back to how this affects, so essentially, on one hand, government is sucking resources through government budget, through taxes. They go towards military effort, manufacturing, equipment, and expenses, paying people to join Russian army. Because for those who are not familiar, all of the Russian army who is fighting in Ukraine, those are not conscripts. Those are people who we call it paid volunteers. Probably not the right term, but I don't know what the term would be. But essentially, they incentivized their sort of I would say call it patriotic feeling is incentivized by the money. And the initial bonus at this point is extremely high. It got to about I think in some instances so like $40,000. The initial bonus that's being paid to people who decide to join Russian military and fight in Ukraine. And it's been growing quite a bit over past, let's say, year and a half, because Russia also getting to the point where there is a fewer people who are willing to sort of join Russia's fight in Ukraine, even for the relatively significant amount of money for Russia. So I still trying to finish my thought about this situation in Russian economy. So government, by sucking up resources for, let's say, non-consumer purposes, is creating inflation in Russian economy, and inflation obviously destroying standard of living, and that leads to, not insulating Russian citizens from economic pain of the war. And the way Russian government is sort of insulating and keeping control of things, inflation under control, is by increasing interest rates, which is done through Russian central bank. And I think they are like 21% per year, so which is, as you can imagine, extremely high. So that really helps to suppress inflation. It's still pretty high, but it's not out of the control high. And that's what's really Russian government concerned, because if it's out of control high, it may lead to what happened in the Russian Empire in 1917, in February 1917, which was revolution there. And so they obviously understand this dynamic, and so they want to avoid this. So when central bank keeps interest rates very high, that really depresses any activity in the private sectors. So, and because a lot of Russian private sector and actually consumers are over leveraged, they heavily indebted. I don't think this is understood in the West. This really creates huge stress on this high interest rates, huge stress on both private sector, on businesses, and consumers, and also on the commercial banks, because if private business doesn't have money, consumer doesn't have money, then they don't pay to banks, and you can have a banking crisis. And so what happened in Russia, and that's why I want to discuss this, because it was a very important moment that Russian central bank had to pump money into Russian financial system, gave money, basically lent money to Russian central banks through repo mechanism. But that's typical mechanism how the central bank gives all lends proper word. Money to to commercial banks, so they stay liquid. That there is no problem with bank bankruptcies. So as you can see, things are really getting tight in Russian financial system and Russian economy, because financial system is really the mirror of the economy. They reflect trends in the economy, and again, this is where generally speaking, Russian economy is in a difficult situation. How much longer they can sort of last this way, I don't know. I don't think Russian economy is going to collapse tomorrow, months, 2 months, 3 months, and even if there is big problems, I think Russian as a society will continue the war, unless there is decision by, as I stated, by Russian political top to have some kind of agreement. And the only way is, I think, where there is middle ground for or solution, or really the solution that's actually lasting, that's not temporary, is essentially neutral status of Ukraine and Ukraine territorial integrity. So there will be sort of compromise that probably will not keep anyone happy, but at the same time, that's a durable solution that can last a long time. And the unfortunate situation is that I don't think either side is ready for that solution, and so this escalation probably will continue. At the same time, I would say that this threat of nuclear war is completely overblown. At the same time, it's totally possible in the process of escalation that Russia may hit some military targets in outside, let's say, of Ukraine. And this is completely hypothetical, but I would say suggest that one of the targets could be NATO headquarters in Finland, in Mikele, which is 140 kilometers from, I think, Russian border. And generally, Finland is becoming big pain problem for Russia. Most people focus on Baltic states, but that's actually not a problem for Russia, where there is a lot of pain for Russia, from Russian perspective, obviously. I'm not saying that this is right, but this is how Russia perceives. So I'm talking perception of the Russian military top is really Finland. In NATO presence, mostly NATO presence in Finland. So that's the biggest sort of threat from Russian perspective. There's also this NATO surveillance, radar surveillance system that was installed in Poland on the Baltic Sea shore there. So that could be another sort of potential target. But those two probably most realistic targets if things really escalate. So this is not high probability, is very low probability. But if things go escalation wise, what's more likely happening than nuclear war is, Russian hit with conventional missiles against some of this military, vast military installations. So now I'm actually going to switch finally to Ukraine and situation on battlefield. In summary, things continue to deteriorate for Ukraine, and I think Ukraine is approaching a moment where it could be significant catastrophic changes on the front line, and it's all driven by absence of motivation of Ukrainian soldier. Not even so Ukrainian soldier, but Ukrainian citizen. Which in turn is driven by complete incompetence of Ukrainian political and military top. So that's sort of Ukrainian problem. That's so far also is not being resolved. There is not even sort of solution on the horizon, and that's why sometimes I mention this 1917 moment for Ukraine, because that's where it's headed, unless some sort of miracle is gonna happen, or somehow the war stops, and if there is sort of temporarily and non-durable sort of truce happening, that's maybe will conserve the situation. But again, that's why I mentioned it's not durable. In couple years, I don't know, 5 years, this conflict will reignite. Now, actually, I'm gonna do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do, starting from very north and specifically Kursk region of Russia. So the general trend continues. Ukrainian forces continuing to losing territory in Kursk region, and for example, there is confirmed that Russian forces took control of this village Darino here. So again, slowly but surely, Ukraine is losing its presence in Kursk region. Now let's move to the situation northeast or north of Kharkiv. Things here more or less quiet, no major movements by either side. Now let's look at the North Lugansk section of the front line. Similar story is here in terms of prior videos, is Russian pressure, mostly focused on Kupiansk. So far, no new Russian advances in northeastern part of Kupiansk. So far, they are contained. I wouldn't say that this is sort of durable situation. It's more a temporary reprieve. And then Russian pressure continues in the southern sector, but without any major Russian gains there. Now let's look at the North Donbass front line. The northern sector is quiet, and that's actually where there's a very interesting development in Russian army, that the commander who was responsible for this sector was relieved, because he didn't. This is because he didn't have any successes here, and this is. One of the, I think probably the only one, the only sector of the front line where Ukrainian forces more or less managed to keep the front line here intact without major Russian advances. And so, therefore, this Russian general was relieved. And the takeaway from this is actually that Russian political top is basically actively changing commanders. If there is someone who is not able to achieve results, they being replaced. So this is generally positive for the system. Unlike situation on the Ukrainian side, where there's no logic, no rhyme, people just being removed or replaced because of the personal sort of preferences or personal likes or dislikes, where basically there's no objective benchmark for removing or installing new people in Ukrainian military command. Now let's look at the situation around Chasiv Yar, and things are developing in a negative direction for Ukrainian forces here. Russian troops continuing to storm Chasiv Yar in sort of frontal, straightforward fashion. They made some progress, and it does appear that that Ukrainian defenses are sort of crumbling in very slow fashion, but essentially Chasiv Yar is going to be probably lost in not in sort of not distant future is probably the best way to describe it. And again, this is driven in this case is more a weakness or problems on Ukrainian side rather than anything related to sort of successes on the Russian side. Now let's look at the situation on the central Donbass front line. So here, Ukrainian front line or defensive line continues to crumble. The most important development is that Russian troops are on outskirts of Velyka Novosilka. This is very important stronghold or remaining important stronghold in this section of the front line for Ukrainian forces. And it appears to be close to, well, I wouldn't say close to be lost, but in, say, long run, the fate is very clear. It's going to be lost. And so this opens up gates even to bigger losses and to Russian advances much deeper into Ukrainian territory, and generally down the road may trigger large-scale collapse in this whole kind of like southeastern corner of the front line in this whole area. And similar processes are happening west of Selidova. Russian troops continuing advance west. No updates in terms of capturing new villages, but mostly they sort of gain control of the fields, but still they continue moving forward in westward here, which again ensures that Pokrovsk is going to be lost. It's just a question of time. That's actually an important point that I probably didn't mention. So if or when, at this point it's more when Ukrainian forces lose Velyka Novosilka, this is an important precondition for capturing by Russian troops Pokrovsk. So then it essentially allows Russian troops to turn and sort of start the operation to capture Pokrovsk. And at this point, I don't even mention Kurakhove is lost, and probably Ukrainian control will last probably at the best a week, maybe over Kurakhove, or maybe 10 days, but maybe could be even sooner than that Ukrainian forces lose Kurakhove. But this is just at this point there's not even any kind of question mark. It's in a very near future. Kurakhove is lost. The fighting is actually happening already in the center of this town, so it's already essentially close to be lost. Now let's look at the situation, and I just want to explain why it's important, because essentially this is this whole corner, southeastern corner, is essentially of Ukrainian defenses is essentially collapsing, and this really opens the gates for Russian army to really advances in many directions. And essentially, first obviously is going to be Pokrovsk, but then they can move towards Dnipro River and down Dnipro and Zaporizhya, which are super critical important cities in Ukraine, and also move up north, even basically back to Izium. So this is why it's extremely critical and extremely negative development, especially from a long-term strategic perspective. Now let's look at the situation on Zaporizhya front line, and things more or less stable. No new updates in terms of Russian advances west of Novosilka, meaning no new villages captured, but I'm sure there are small advances happening, which again makes defending Velyka Novosilka, successful defense of Velyka Novosilka, is less and less likely with every advance here west of Velyka Novosilka. Now let's finish with the last section of the front line along the Dnipro River, and things here are completely quiet. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye bye.